The rain came down in sheets that night, thick and angry, like the sky itself had decided to take sides. Rachel Hartley stood at the back door of her father's farmhouse in central Kansas, one hand pressed against her belly, the other clutching a small gold locket that had belonged to her mother. Behind her, the kitchen light flickered. Inside, her stepmother Patricia was still screaming. Her half-sister Chloe stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching Rachel like she was a stray dog that had finally been caught. Patricia's voice cut through the storm, calling Rachel a disgrace, a liar, a girl who had brought shame on the family name. Rachel's father Arthur stood at the table, his face pale, his hands shaking. He didn't say a word, he just pointed toward the road. Rachel stepped out into the mud, the rain soaking through her thin jacket, and the door slammed behind her. She heard the lock click. That sound, that small, final click, stayed with her longer than the cold or the fear. She walked down the gravel drive, past the barn where she had spent every morning since she was 12, past the pasture where her mother's favorite horse used to graze, and she didn't look back. She had nothing but the locket, a $20 bill folded inside her shoe, and a life growing inside her that she was determined to protect. Before we continue, remember that this is still a small channel, and I could really use your support. Please like the video and subscribe. It's free, and it helps more than you know. Rachel made it to the edge of town before the storm broke her. She found shelter under the awning of a closed gas station, her clothes heavy with water, her teeth chattering. She was 19 years old, 7 months pregnant, and completely alone. The baby's father was a seasonal worker who had passed through the area the year before, a kind man who had promised to write, but the letters never came. Rachel didn't blame him. She barely blamed herself. She just kept moving. The next morning, she hitched a ride to Wichita with a trucker who didn't ask questions. She spent her first night in the city on a bench at the bus station, using her jacket as a blanket, holding the locket in her palm like a compass. She found work washing dishes at a diner on the south side, a place called Ruby's, where the grease never fully left the air. The owner, a woman named Darlene, let her sleep in the storage room for the first month. Rachel saved every penny. She learned to budget, to stretch a can of beans into 3 meals, to walk everywhere to save bus fare. She gave birth to a boy in a county hospital, alone, with no one to hold her hand. She named him Samuel, after her mother's father. When she held him for the first time, she whispered a promise into his tiny ear. No one will ever throw us away again. The turning point came 6 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other. Rachel was cleaning tables at Ruby's when an older man in a pressed suit sat down in her section. He ordered black coffee and a slice of pie, but he didn't eat it. He just stared at the locket that had slipped out from under Rachel's collar while she wiped the counter. He asked where she got it. Rachel hesitated. She told him it was her mother's. He asked if he could look at it more closely. She handed it over, and he examined the engraving on the back with a magnifying glass he pulled from his pocket. His name was Dr. Harrison Cole, a retired professor of agricultural economics from Kansas State University. He explained that the locket was not just a family heirloom. The gold was rare, the craftsmanship unique, but what caught his attention was the tiny inscription inside, a date and a set of coordinates. He told Rachel that her mother had likely hidden something important, maybe a deed or a trust, and that she should look into it. Rachel didn't have the money for a lawyer, but Dr. Cole offered to help. He saw something in her eyes, he said later, a fire that reminded him of his own daughter, who had died young. He offered Rachel a job at his small consulting firm, helping farmers manage their finances. He taught her about soil credits, commodity markets, land valuation. Rachel absorbed everything. She studied at night after putting Samuel to bed, reading textbooks borrowed from Dr. Cole's library. Within 3 years, she had become his lead analyst. Within 5, she had saved enough to buy a small house on the outskirts of Wichita. Within 7, she was managing a portfolio of distressed farmland across 3 states. But she never forgot the farm. She never forgot the way Patricia had laughed when the door closed, or the way Chloe had smiled. She kept a folder with old newspaper clippings about the property, tracking its decline through public records. The farm had been in her mother's family for 4 generations. After Rachel left, Patricia and Chloe ran it into the ground. They took out loans against the land, bought equipment they didn't need, and let the fields go fallow. Arthur, her father, had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia, and Patricia used his condition to take control of everything. By the time Rachel turned 29, the farm was drowning in debt. The bank had already filed a notice of default. Patricia and Chloe were scrambling, trying to sell off pieces of the land to cover their losses. Rachel watched from a distance. She didn't act. Not yet. She was waiting for the right moment. That moment came when Dr. Cole introduced her to a client who specialized in buying distressed agricultural debt. Rachel proposed a plan. She would form a shell company, purchase the note on her family's farm, and then foreclose. It was legal. It was clean. And it was the only way to get back what had been stolen from her. Dr. Cole agreed to back her. He said he believed in her, and that was enough. Rachel set up a limited liability company called Heartland Holdings, named after her son, and quietly bought the debt for pennies on the dollar. The farm was now hers, legally and without question, but she didn't want to just take it. She wanted them to know who had taken it from them. She drove back to the farm on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. The gravel road was the same, but the fence was falling apart. The barn roof had collapsed on one side. The pasture was overgrown with weeds. She parked her sedan at the gate and walked up to the front porch. Patricia answered the door, older now, her face lined with bitterness. She didn't recognize Rachel at first. Rachel had cut her hair short, wore a tailored blazer, and carried a leather briefcase. Patricia asked if she was from the bank. Rachel said no. She opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder. She said, "I'm here to serve you an eviction notice." Patricia's face went white. She called for Chloe, who came running from the kitchen. Chloe looked at Rachel, and then she looked at the locket, which Rachel had deliberately worn outside her collar. Chloe's mouth fell open. She whispered, "It can't be." Rachel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. She said, "It is. I own this land now. Every acre, every blade of grass, every brick in this house. You have 30 days to vacate." Patricia started screaming, calling Rachel a liar, threatening to call the police. Rachel pulled out the notarized documents, the bank statements, the transfer of title. She said, "Call them. I'll wait." Patricia didn't call. She just stood there, trembling. But Rachel knew the fight wasn't over. She had learned, through her contacts, that Patricia and Chloe were desperate. They had been selling off equipment and livestock to pay gambling debts. They had also been neglecting Arthur, who was now confined to a small room in the back of the house, barely fed, barely cared for. Rachel visited him that same afternoon, after Patricia and Chloe had retreated inside. She found her father sitting in a wheelchair, staring at the wall. He didn't recognize her at first. His eyes were clouded, his hands thin. Rachel knelt beside him and took his hand. She said, "Dad, it's me, Rachel." He looked at her, and something flickered in his eyes. He whispered, "I'm sorry." Rachel squeezed his hand. She said, "I know, I'm here now." She arranged for him to be moved to a care facility in Wichita that same evening, with a nurse she had already hired. She didn't tell Patricia or Chloe. She just did it. The climax came 3 nights later. Rachel had anticipated that Patricia and Chloe would try to destroy the farm rather than let her have it. She had installed hidden cameras around the property, motion-activated, with night vision. She had also notified the local sheriff's department, who had agreed to monitor the feed. On the 3rd night, at 2 a.m, the cameras picked up movement. Patricia and Chloe emerged from the house, carrying a gas can and a box of matches. They walked to the main barn, where Rachel had stored a small amount of hay and equipment. Patricia poured gasoline along the walls. Chloe lit a match. The flames caught instantly, climbing the dry wood. But before the fire could spread, the sheriff's cruisers arrived, lights flashing. Patricia and Chloe tried to run, but deputies cut them off. They were arrested on the spot, charged with arson, attempted destruction of property, and elder neglect. The fire was contained within minutes. The barn suffered minor damage, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. Rachel watched from her car, parked a quarter-mile down the road. She didn't feel triumph. She felt a deep, quiet relief, like a knot that had been tied for 10 years, finally coming undone. She drove back to the farm the next morning. The deputies had taken Patricia and Chloe to the county jail. The farm was quiet. Rachel walked through the empty house, room by room. She stopped in the kitchen, where her mother used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. She opened the pantry and found a jar of her mother's handwritten recipes, still there untouched. She held the jar for a long time. Then she went outside and looked at the land. The sun was rising over the fields, painting the overgrown grass gold. She thought about her son Samuel, who was 9 years old now, smart and curious, who had never seen this place. She thought about her mother, who had died when Rachel was 6, who had left her the locket and a love for the soil. She thought about Dr. Cole, who had believed in her when no one else did, and she thought about the women who would come after her. Today, that farm is no longer a place of pain. It is a training center for women who have been abandoned, abused, or discarded by their families. Rachel founded the Heartland Women's Agricultural Institute, a non-profit that teaches sustainable farming, business management, and financial literacy. The first class had 12 students, the second had 30. Now there is a waiting list. The old barn, the one that Patricia tried to burn down, was rebuilt and turned into a classroom. The kitchen where Rachel's mother once cooked is now a communal dining hall, where women sit together and share meals and stories. Arthur, Rachel's father, lives in a small cottage on the property, cared for by a full-time nurse. He has good days and bad days, but on good days, he sits on the porch and watches the students work in the fields. Sometimes he smiles. Samuel, now a teenager, helps teach the younger students about soil science. He wears the locket around his neck, a gift from his mother on his 13th birthday. The last time Rachel saw Patricia and Chloe was at their sentencing hearing. They were convicted and sentenced to prison. Patricia tried to apologize, but Rachel didn't stay to hear it. She walked out of the courtroom, past the reporters, past the cameras, and got into her car. She drove back to the farm, where the sun was setting over the new greenhouse. She stood at the edge of the field, her hands in her pockets, and she thought about the night she had been thrown out. She thought about the rain, the mud, the cold, and she thought about the promise she had made to her son. She had kept it. She had built something out of nothing, not out of revenge, but out of the stubborn, unbreakable belief that she was worth more than what they had told her. The land had been taken from her, and she had taken it back. But more than that, she had turned it into a place where no one would ever be thrown away again. And that, she knew, was the only victory that mattered. A cool breeze swept across the fields as the first light of dawn touched the new greenhouse. Rachel stood at the edge of the vegetable rows, watching the irrigation system pulse to life. Behind her, the main building hummed with activity. The morning shift of students was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast from the garden's harvest. She heard Samuel's voice before she saw him, laughing with a group of younger girls near the chicken coop. He had grown tall over the past year, his shoulders broadening, his hands calloused from work. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that reminded Rachel of her mother. "Mum, you're going to be late for the ceremony," Samuel called, jogging over. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "Mrs. Alvarez wants to know if you're ready." Rachel smiled. Today was the first graduation of the Institute's advanced cohort. 10 women who'd arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and left with certifications in sustainable agriculture, business accounting, and leadership. 2 of them had already secured jobs at local cooperatives. One had started her own community garden in a low-income neighborhood in Wichita. Rachel had watched them transform, just as she had transformed from discarded to indispensable. She walked to the main hall, where the students had decorated the walls with dried flowers and hand-painted banners. The smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon filled the air. Dr. Cole sat in the front row, his cane resting against his chair. He was 84 now, his eyes still sharp, his voice still steady. He nodded at Rachel as she passed. Arthur was in his usual spot near the window, a blanket over his knees, a cup of tea untouched beside him. He turned his head as Rachel approached, and for a moment his gaze focused. He reached out and touched her hand. "My girl," he whispered. Rachel squeezed his fingers. The ceremony was simple. Rachel stood at the podium and looked at the faces of the graduates, young women who had been cast out by their families, who had survived abuse, addiction, poverty. She told them the same thing she had told Samuel the night he was born. No one will ever throw you away again. Not here, not ever. The applause was loud, but what stayed with Rachel was the silence that followed, the quiet, steady hum of a place that had been rebuilt on dignity. Afterward, Samuel found her in the old barn, now a classroom. He held out the locket, which had slipped from his neck while he worked. "Can you fix the clasp?" he asked. Rachel took it, turned it over in her palm. The gold was warm. She opened it and looked at the tiny inscription inside, her mother's handwriting, faded but legible. "This land holds you. Hold it back." Rachel closed the locket and fastened it around Samuel's neck. "It's already fixed," she said. "It never broke." That evening, Rachel sat on the porch of Arthur's cottage, watching the sun sink behind the silos. The fields were green again, planted with a rotation of wheat, sorghum, and cover crops. The Institute had just received a grant to expand into organic certification. Samuel was inside, reading to Arthur from an old farming manual. Rachel pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photos from the graduation. Smiling faces, hands holding diplomas, children running through the grass. She stopped on a picture of herself, standing alone at the edge of the field, the locket visible at her collar. She remembered the rain, the mud, the click of the lock. She remembered the bench at the bus station, the hunger, the fear, and she remembered the promise. She put the phone away and looked out at the land. It was quiet now, except for the crickets and the distant hum of the irrigation pump. Rachel Hartley, who had been thrown out like trash, sat on the porch of her father's house, which was now her house, on land that had been stolen and reclaimed, and she felt, for the first time in 10 years, completely at peace. She had not just survived. She had built a world where survival was no longer enough, where thriving was the only option, and that, she knew, was the only legacy that mattered.